influenced by the military people. That's one part of it, the political necessity for the act, that it has remained in the statute book by the Congress as well as the non-Congress governments. Let's look at the judicial sanction given by the Naga People's Act. Now, the Naga People's Act, what did it say? Very shortly, I'll tell you that it says it is not a colorable legislation or a fraud on the Constitution, and we had a situation where one of the state governments was opposing the union in this matter, supported by various human rights activists who all had their say when the matter was taken up by the Supreme Court. And it also, the court also held in this judgment that it does not confer an arbitrary or unguided power. Now, the court did not stop there. Proceeding further, it decided to bring in certain conditions, or if I may say limitations. For example, it introduced the limitation that a notification bringing in the AFSPA shall have a definite shelf life of 6 months, and thereafter it would be reviewed whether it should be retained in the same state, the full state, the complete state, or should go out of a portion of the state. It also said that, say, for example, a person arrested, the armed forces are required to hand him over to the nearest magistrate within 24 hours, excluding the time taken for journey. Now, these sort of limitations, conditions, or caveats were brought in by the Supreme Court in their wisdom. They also said that while the union, given the federal character of our Constitution, the union has the authority to invoke AFSPA, yet it is desirable that the state government should be consulted. And they also talked about the use of minimal force. Now, while the Supreme Court did this by inserting the doctrine of use of minimal force, well, this has been there for the army from day one. One of the doctrines, one of the basic principles of war is of the use of minimum force. And also, condition was brought in that the CRPC provisions relating to search and seizure are required to be read into this act. Now, I wish to highlight here that it is nobody's case that no aberrations by army have ever taken place. Nobody has said that. But what is important and significant to note is, in each and every such case where a human rights violation has taken place, it is Army's stiff, strict, and prompt military law regime which comes into play, and exemplary action is taken after due investigation against the persons who have been found guilty for any misdemeanor. Secondly, of course, there would be situations like collateral damage, but then collateral damage is to be avoided. It is always avoided by the Army. Now, what has happened is that though this the doctrine or the code of ethics, which is supposed to be discussed today, was not taken up, I would only say that a soldier, whether of the army or any of the paramilitary forces which have been deployed there, each one of the soldiers is subject to the law of the land. In addition, being a soldier and a man in uniform, he is also subject to the military law provisions. Now, both these effective provisions, when they are already in place, I wonder if there is really a need for any extra code. Also, I would like to highlight here that it was said that it would be a strict code for application in India. Now, that is quite surprising, because the military operations, whether for counterinsurgency, take place in India, or they may be planned, they may originate and executed from outside. We had the situation that happened against the attack against the Taj Hotel in Bombay. Now, would it mean that should, in a contingency, that such an act was to be formulated, which I feel is quite impractical, uncalled for, would not be applicable in a situation like this? Having said that, this is an act which does not have rules under the AFSPA, which is normally a condition in any of the statutes. So there could be a situation where framing of certain rules could be thought about to bring out as to what is meant by a disturbed situation or a dangerous situation. It could allow and lay down a time-bound investigation, although the speed of investigations is already there. Now, such provisions could be inserted in the rules which could be framed under the Act, but otherwise, in its present form, Armed Forces Special Power Act, which has got the legal sanctity and also the political expediency that I mentioned, is really, there is no case to think of its revocation or the Act being repealed. Thank you.
Indeed, there is no better person than an ex-Judge Advocate General to defend the conscience of the army. And Major General Neelendra Kumar made 4 important points. The idea of leveling the playing field while entering into counterinsurgency operations. The idea that it had acquired some measure of parliamentary authority by virtue of the fact that all governments have similarly passed the Act repeatedly. The fact that the arbitrariness has been restrained by judicial principles such as the use of minimum force. And if at all any change ought to be made to status quo, it could come by way of rules made to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. To continue the debate from proposition, we call upon Dr. Sridhar.
Distinguished speakers and ladies and gentlemen. Now I stand here for the motion and continuing from where Shri Nurani stopped. I would like to highlight what's happening at the ground level because of these acts. Now, taking a cue from the analogy that was given by the previous speaker that it's kind of uneven battle or a cricket match where one team is not allowed to wear the pads, we can ask a question it back. Even if that were to be true, that one side is not allowed to wear the bats, now does that give them the right to take the wicket and hit the other person? So the question is again the question is not whether the army is willing or unwilling, whether the government is willing or unwilling to repeal the act. Because after all, army is an apparatus of the state and it functions according to the desires and designs of the state, sometimes more than that. So to believe that the state has ideas which are other than what the army does is something that's not easy to believe. For instance, the whole idea of a place to be called disturbed, where an insurgent itself is a creation of the state. In fact, I would like to argue as a human rights person that the state, no militant action ever begins that way. There is always a long period where people have struggled and then they take to arms. In other words, we can argue that the governments, states wait till the situation brews to such a level where people take to arms. And then the state can handle that situation because the state understands only the language of law and order and nothing else. And Kashmir and Northeast is the classic case for this. Today, Kashmir, for example, is a very, very emotional issue. And even those intellectuals and progressives, quote unquote, who believe that Kashmir is an integral part of India, like the state believes, also somewhere admit that the atrocities committed by the army is something that is deplorable. Let's not forget that all forms of discrimination and exercise of violence is not an end in itself, but a means to assert something else. As someone put it, Kashmir is bleeding so that India can prove its secularism. And the Kashmir, the army has to show its might and power over the people of Kashmir so that rest of the Indians can learn the lesson from that. In fact, when Indian government talks about national security, it simply means that, look, what we can do to those who challenge the national security. It comes from a firm belief that boundaries are non-negotiable, which it is not. History tells us that boundaries keep changing. And more important, it's not simply a question of law and order. It's not a question of APSA. It's a larger political, ethical, and even, I would say, a civilizational question. Because what kind of society are we going to build with these draconian laws? As has been pointed out, Kashmir or Northeast is a kind of experimental places. For instance, the military used the renegades, even local civil defense committees, to commit atrocities against its own people indirectly. And that was later converted into a very successful experiment in Chhattisgarh called Salwa Jud. So this is how it operates. If integrating Kashmir or Northeast to rest of India is the main purpose of this kind of struggle, then military atrocities will certainly work against this kind of desire. That itself is the main reason why the atrocity should stop, because you don't have to be a human rights person, you don't have to be an expert on Kashmir, but if you go to Kashmir, for example, you will see that the alienation is complete and total. Talk to anyone, and that is mainly because of the military experience, because the only experience of mainland India, as they call it, is through the army. There is no other experience, because there is no other development, nothing else. The state comes to them only in the form of the army and its atrocity. And that is one of the prime reasons why I would say it's not even debatable that the atrocity should stop, the act should be repealed. And we have been told that some violations may have happened. They are all individual initiatives, sometimes wrong initiatives, and the institution cannot be blamed for that. But let's quickly look at the figures and then say whether they are all just individual cases or directly or indirectly have a larger institutional sanction. As on November 2012, there are about 70,000 deaths, civilians, disclosures of more than 6,000 unknown, unmarked mass graves. In fact, a Kashmiri told us when we were touring Kashmir as human rights activists that Kashmiris have two names, one when they are alive, one after they die. Because most of them, the innocent civilians who have been picked up and killed, they die as militants. Some name is given to them after they die. And now, when the people of Kashmir, and I should mention here that Kashmir perhaps is the only place on earth where they have a unique organization called the Association of the Parents of the Missing Children. And there are more than 6,000 missing people. Then, according to a report by the human rights group, there are about 500 individual perpetrators of violence, which includes 235 army personnel, 123 paramilitary personnel, 100 and odd Jammu and Kashmir police, 31 government-backed militants, and the list of perpetrators include 2 major generals, 3 brigadiers, 9 colonels, 3 lieutenant colonels, 78 majors, 25 captains of the Indian Army, as well as 2 additional director generals of Central Paramilitary Forces. Now, the state of impunity has been talked about, and I think the speakers who come after me will take it up, because there is a famous Patibal fake encounter case, and Supreme Court has come down very heavily on that case, particularly vindicating the actions of the people. Now, there is also a very dangerous thing that's happening because of this, a fallout, that is the privatizing of impunity. The army is shifting the impunity to the common people. As I said, the renegades are allowed to do things on their behalf. So I would like to call it privatizing the impunity itself. And there is an incentive to impunity. Providing monetary benefits, incentives, and awards for killing supposed militants functions as a kind of incentive. There are cases where officers have been given gallantry awards and out-of-turn promotions for anti-militancy operations. So it in a way he's working as a kind of incentive to kill more number of people. The more number of people you kill, the better service record you will have. And I would like to end here with quoting one concrete case of Mrs. Masuda Parveen. Her husband was not a militant, he was doing some kind of a business. He had some pieces of land, he borrowed money, he couldn't repay it, so the other persons went to a renegade, because the renegades also operate as local gundas, and then the case went on. And finally, there was a case registered against this person. The army took him to a place, that is the affidavit they have filed before the court, which the court finally has upheld, because he had buried some arms and ammunition. And when he was showing the place to the army where he had buried the arms and ammunition, there was a blast and he was killed. Now that's the story. The question is, when did the army take over itself the role of conducting an inquiry? The police station from the place where they allegedly had buried the arms is 4 or 5 kilometers away. They could have informed the police. The police have no idea about this. But surprisingly and unfortunately, the Supreme Court held this up and said that he is a militant. His wife told us, I had faith in the Indian government till this judgment came. Now I have lost faith in India and its government. Now this is the situation which is a result of this kind of impunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sridhar. And in a discussion of the nature that we are conducting today, where it is a discussion of ethics, we cannot divorce ourselves from the facts of the situation. And there was nobody better than Dr. Sridhar to bring us back to the facts of the situation. As he stated, even in an unbalanced battle that we are fighting, there are legitimate expectations. Even the restraint that is expected of the armed forces is justified because they are the legitimate armed force of a democratic nation. But, and if I may, one of the most complicated things in framing this debate was the attempt to shift away from the discussion of whether there must at all exist such a legislation into a discussion of, as the introductory speaker had pointed out, it's not a question of whether we must enter the conflict, but how the conflict must be conducted. And I invite Major General Venugopal, with his vast experience on this issue, to look back at the question of code of ethics and how the conflict must therefore be conducted. Thank you.
Respected speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I am here to speak against the motion. Firstly, I'll clarify certain issues raised by the previous speaker before I lose track of those. Firstly, we have to understand who are the militants in J&K. Are they Indians or are they from Afghanistan, Iran, Central Asian republics or any other nation? Should we deal with them in the same manner as we deal with our own citizens? Second, the human rights activists have given a lot of issues against the army and the armed forces. But how many other human rights violation cases which happen every day in our country, how many of them have they enumerated, progressed, and brought to book? It is very easy to sensationalize issues in J&K and Northeast and blame the army for all the ills. Unfortunately, it is also the fault of the army that we have not been able to project ourselves in a better manner or to tell the actual picture that is happening in these places to the public. Probably the media management, to that extent, we have not succeeded. That may be the reason why a large number of people are not aware of what is happening in J&K. After having spent almost 10 years in J&K myself, I think I am fairly competent enough to tell you that there is no poverty in Jammu and Kashmir, especially in Kashmir. There is nowhere destruction has taken place the way it has been brought about. I was a brigade commander about 3 years back in a very bad area, Patan, near Baramulla. That is the time there was a lot of hue and cry that the army must pull out. So as a town commander, I had gathered almost 5,000 people. And I told them that after 15 days we would be leaving and we will be going back to peace areas. Next day there was a large number of people who came to my headquarters to plead that the army must stay on. There are two types of people. One who actually, they are actually a minority who plan stories and bring out certain aberrations that take place and magnify it and show to the public. Whereas the majority of people in Kashmir today want the army to stay on. They're fed up of the militants. They're fed up of the foreign terrorists who have come and looted them, raped their women folk. And they've realized who are the actual culprits today. So if you carry out an enumeration of people who want to support, you'll find large majority are with the army. And Indian Army is the only army in the world which has operated in democratically elected states. We have cooperated with the state governments, district administration, all projects which is under the district administration and the state government, we have helped to execute. So now getting back to the topic of code of ethics. There is already a code of ethics existing in the army, which has been very effective. In fact, as a major, as a lieutenant colonel, over a period of time, in fact, all of us were supposed to carry this code in our pockets, both in English and Hindi. And every evening we used to read it out to the men and explain to them why we need to follow this. So what code are we going to make which is better than the code which is already existing? I don't think, and this has been legally validated, the code that we are following today. So I strongly feel that the code that the Indian Army follows today is sufficient enough, and no other code which is to be enforced on it is required. Now, I'll give you a few points to ponder. Firstly, we need to understand the definition of the armed forces. Today, in the valley and the northeast, it's not only the army. There are large number of central armed police forces operating. When I say central armed police forces, the Assam Rifles, the BSF, ITBP, SSB, CRPF, and all the state police forces are included in that. State police forces are separate, all the others are central armed police forces. Now, if you go to J&K today, the entire Srinagar town where maximum problems occur are with the J&K police and the CRPF. The army is only operating in the hinterland where you find the residual number of terrorists and militants who get across from the border, LC, and enter into our territory and operate. So firstly, and they all wear combat uniform, and when the press or the media comes to visit, it is taken that everybody is army. So do you also include them in this code of ethics? Second, when an Indian Army battalion is inducted into the valley or in the northeast, we train them. They undergo a training capsule of 6 weeks before they are inducted into actual operations. They are trained to follow orders, ensure that whatever rules of the game are followed in letter and spirit. Subsequently, we organize seminars, discussions, and explain to each Jawan who enter, fresh ones who come from peace stations, they're educated as to how they must behave in these areas. Thirdly, now you talk about National Human Rights Commission. National Human Rights Commission in India was established after the Indian Army started its own human rights cells. Indian Army's first human rights organization was established in 93 March. And 6 months later, Indian government appointed the National Human Rights Commission. So I don't think all these activists of human rights in India can speak so authoritatively against the army. By merely getting few data, you imagine there is 1/3 of the Indian Army is deployed in counterinsurgency operations. Indian Army has got about 12 lakhs personnel, out of about 4 to 4.5 lakhs of army is deployed. And this army has been deployed since independence. After 89, in J&K and Northeast put together, we have 1/3 of our strength there. We have tried our best to ensure that operations are conducted as per law and as acceptable to the people of that place. But where you have the foreign elements coming in, foreign terrorists operating there, the same rules cannot be applied. And it is very difficult for the army to understand who is a foreign terrorist, whether it is a Pakistani, Afghani, or a Kashmiri. And it's only much later, once a person gets killed and nobody comes to claim his body, then we come to know that he is not a Kashmiri. The previous speaker spoke about missing people. The missing people, missing children, where are they? Large number of these children went across to Pakistan. They are now in Pakistan. They are in various places